The room went silent. Not the comfortable kind. The kind where people suddenly stop breathing the same way. My father cleared his throat. My mother stared at the table. Across from them, the man in the grey suit slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. No one spoke. My father forced a laugh. Then he said something he shouldn't have said. Something that made the investor's expression change completely. That's when I realized something was very wrong. 3 months earlier, nothing about my life looked unusual. I worked long hours. Quiet work. Numbers, forecasts, financial models. The kind of work most people only notice when something goes wrong. My parents had built a mid-sized logistics company over 20 years. Trucking contracts, warehouse distribution, regional shipping routes. It wasn't glamorous, but it made them wealthy. Family dinners were still mandatory. Every Sunday evening. Same table. Same routine. My father talking about business. My mother agreeing with him. And me, mostly listening. I had studied finance. Not because my parents wanted me to join their company. Actually, they preferred that I didn't. They had a favorite sentence. You wouldn't understand how real business works. They didn't say it with anger. More like polite dismissal. If I asked a question about their expansion plans, my father would smile thinly. Corporate finance is different from classroom finance. If I mentioned risk exposure or debt ratios, my mother would wave her hand. You're overthinking it. So eventually, I stopped offering opinions. I focused on my own job instead. An investment firm across the city. Quiet office. Small team. We evaluated companies before large funds decided whether to invest. Due diligence. That was my department. It sounds more dramatic than it is. Mostly spreadsheets. Contracts. Background checks. Risk models. But over time, something small started to bother me. At first it was just numbers. Inconsistent revenue reporting across regional branches. Nothing huge. Just odd timing differences. The kind that could easily be explained by accounting delays. But then came the expansion announcement. My parents were suddenly planning to double their fleet. New warehouses. 3 new distribution contracts. All within 6 months. It didn't make sense. Companies usually expand gradually. Their company had always been careful. Slow. Conservative. Yet now my father spoke about expansion at every dinner. Almost rehearsed. The market is wide open. We're finally scaling. We have backing. That last sentence caught my attention. Backing. I asked once, casually. Who's investing? My father smiled the same tight smile. You wouldn't understand the structure. My mother laughed softly. It's big league financing. Then she added the sentence I had heard since college. You've never actually run a company. I let it go. But I started noticing small things. Phone calls that ended when I walked into the room. Financial documents quickly folded away. My parents suddenly attending investor meetings twice a week. Still, nothing concrete. Just discomfort. And when I mentioned that the speed of expansion seemed risky, my father gave the same answer. You're thinking like an analyst, not a builder. My mother nodded. You worry too much. So I stopped bringing it up. But I didn't stop looking. At work, a new file appeared in our firm's pipeline. Confidential. Mid-sized logistics company seeking major investment. The numbers looked familiar. Extremely familiar. When I opened the document, my stomach tightened. It was my parents' company. But the financial projections inside the report were not the ones my father talked about at dinner. They were different. Aggressively different. Revenue inflated. Debt hidden through layered shell contracts. If those numbers were presented to investors as real projections, it wasn't just optimism. It was deception. I closed the file. Sat there quietly. Then I reopened it. Because something else bothered me even more. The investor reviewing the company was one of the largest logistics funds in the country. If they approved the deal, it would be worth tens of millions. And someone had signed off on the due diligence preparation. Someone from inside our firm. Someone who had approved the numbers. I stared at the name on the document. It wasn't mine. Which meant one thing. Someone had rushed this file past the verification stage. And suddenly the strange dinners, the quiet phone calls, the secretive meetings, started forming a pattern. But when I asked my parents directly if they had outside investment discussions, my father smiled again. Same smile. You wouldn't understand the negotiations. My mother added softly, just focus on your little analyst job. They dismissed the question completely. So I didn't argue. I didn't warn them. I didn't accuse them. I did something else instead. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. Watching quietly changes the way you notice things. People relax around you when they think you're not paying attention. They speak more freely. They make assumptions. That's what happened with my parents. At Sunday dinner the following week, my father mentioned the investor meeting again. He didn't say the name of the firm, but he described the deal structure with unusual pride. Once the capital clears, we scale immediately. My mother added. Fleet expansion first. Warehouses second. They spoke like the deal was already done. But the investment review at my firm hadn't even reached the approval committee yet. Which meant something else was happening behind the scenes. That bothered me. So the next morning at work, I accessed the internal file again. Carefully. Every company seeking funding goes through a process. Initial submission. Preliminary review. Risk evaluation. Independent verification. Then the investment committee. Normally the verification stage takes weeks. This file had been cleared in 4 days. That was the first red flag. The second appeared when I examined the supporting documents. Revenue confirmations from regional branches. Supplier contracts. Debt statements. Everything looked professional. But something about the formatting was inconsistent. Not the numbers. The documents themselves. Different metadata. Different export systems. Which meant they hadn't come from the same accounting software. Someone had assembled them manually. That alone wasn't proof of anything. But it meant I needed the originals. Fortunately, verification teams sometimes request raw data. So I submitted a request for the company's internal ledger exports. The request went out automatically. 2 hours later, the files arrived. I downloaded them. Opened the spreadsheets. And immediately noticed something that made my chest tighten. 2 ledgers existed. One labeled internal accounting. The other labeled investor projection sheet. They were not the same. Not even close. The investor version inflated revenue by nearly 30%. But the real problem wasn't the revenue. It was the debt. Large equipment loans were missing entirely from the investor sheet. Millions in liabilities simply removed. I didn't react right away. I checked timestamps. The investor sheet had been created just 2 weeks earlier. Edited repeatedly. The internal accounting ledger hadn't been changed. Meaning someone had deliberately built a second financial reality. Then I checked something else. The author field. It listed the user account that created the investor sheet. The username belonged to my father. I sat back slowly. For a long time I didn't move. Because if those numbers were presented to the investment fund as official projections, it wasn't just aggressive marketing. It was securities fraud. Still, I needed more than spreadsheets. Spreadsheets can be argued, explained away, misinterpreted. Evidence needed context. So I checked the submission records. Every investment application requires a presentation meeting. The meeting had been recorded automatically through our firm's internal system. I found the video. The meeting room was familiar. Glass table. Wall screen. 4 investors from the fund. My parents sitting across from them. My father presenting the growth projections. The same projections from the altered spreadsheet. He spoke calmly, confidently, pointing to charts that matched the manipulated numbers exactly. One of the investors asked about outstanding debt. My father smiled. Minimal equipment liabilities. Very manageable. The statement was not technically loud. Not dramatic. Just wrong. The recording continued. My mother handed out printed financial summaries. The same ones I had just examined. 30% inflated revenue. Millions in hidden loans. The investors nodded as they reviewed the documents. They believed the numbers. Anyone would have. Because the documents looked official. The presentation ended normally. Handshakes. Polite smiles. No confrontation. No suspicion. Just a potential investment moving forward. I closed the video. Then reopened it again to confirm something. There was no hesitation in my father's voice. No uncertainty. He wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what those numbers were. I checked the internal review notes from our verification team. They were short. Too short. Documents appear consistent. Revenue growth verified. Risk acceptable. Which meant one thing. Whoever approved the file had not looked closely. Or had chosen not to. Either possibility made the situation worse. Because now the deception wasn't just in the company. It had entered the investment process. I exported everything. The ledgers. The video recording. The document metadata. Then I stored copies on 3 separate drives. I didn't call my parents. I didn't send them a message. And I didn't report it immediately either. Because if I confronted them first, they would deny everything. Or worse, they would destroy the evidence. And once the investment money moved, untangling the damage would become impossible. So I made a decision. Quietly. Carefully. Confronting them would have ruined everything. Once you see something clearly, the next step is patience. Not reaction. Reaction gives people time to adjust their story. Evidence gives them nowhere to go. So I treated the situation the same way we treat any high-risk investment case. Documentation first. Protection second. Action last. The first thing I did was secure the evidence properly. 3 encrypted backups. 1 stored on an external drive at home. 1 uploaded to a private secure vault. And 1 sent to a legal archive service our firm occasionally used for sensitive compliance cases. That way, even if something happened to my computer, the records would still exist. Then I reviewed everything again. Slowly. The altered spreadsheets. The metadata. The investor presentation video. The debt records hidden from the projections. There was no ambiguity. The numbers were deliberately manipulated. But the real problem wasn't just my parents. It was the investment process itself. Someone inside our firm had cleared the verification stage without properly reviewing the documents. That meant 2 things. Either they had been careless, or someone had pushed the deal through quickly. Both possibilities required a very careful approach. So I contacted the only person inside the company who dealt with exactly that situation. The compliance officer. Not through email. Not through the internal messaging system. I walked to her office. Quietly. Her name was Laura. She had been with the firm for nearly 15 years. Former regulatory investigator. Calm voice. Precise questions. People inside the company joked that she could detect a lie faster than a machine learning model. When I closed her office door and explained that I needed a confidential review, she didn't interrupt. She just listened. Then she asked one question. Do you have documentation? I handed her the drive. She spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the files in silence. Watching the presentation. Comparing the 2 ledgers. Checking the timestamps. At one point she paused the video when my father discussed debt exposure. Then she opened the internal accounting file. Compared the numbers. Looked back at me. Her expression didn't change. But she nodded slowly. This shouldn't have cleared verification. I didn't respond. She continued reviewing. Then she asked another question. Have you spoken to them? No. Good. She closed the laptop. Then she said something important. If we escalate this through internal channels right now, the company being investigated could be notified too early. That made sense. Investment reviews involve multiple departments. News travels quickly. And if my parents realized an investigation had started, they could restructure accounts, transfer liabilities, move funds. It would complicate everything. Laura leaned back slightly. We need to handle this through the regulatory reporting path. That meant external oversight, financial authorities, formal review. Once that process started, no one could quietly close the file. She created a formal evidence package. Not emotional, not accusatory, just documentation. The presentation recording, both ledgers, the debt contracts, the metadata trail showing when the altered projection sheet was created, and the internal review notes that had approved the file too quickly. Every piece lined up in a clear timeline. Then she filed the report with the Regulatory Compliance Board that oversees investment activity. That step automatically triggered an audit request. But audits don't happen instantly. Investigators need time. And until they arrive, the people being investigated usually have no idea what's coming. Which meant my parents continued their routine. Sunday dinner. Confident conversations. My father discussing expansion plans. My mother talking about warehouse construction. They believed the investment would close within weeks. They believed everything was proceeding normally. One evening my father even asked if I had heard anything about their company through my work connections. I answered honestly, no. Because technically that was true. The investigation hadn't started yet. But it was scheduled. 2 weeks later, at the investment firm headquarters, where the final investor meeting would take place. The same room where they had presented their projections before. Only this time, several additional people would be present. Regulatory auditors, compliance investigators, and the lead partner from the investment fund. None of that had been announced. My parents believed they were attending the final approval meeting. They expected signatures, celebration, a major investment. They had no reason to think otherwise. From their perspective, it was just another step in the deal. From everyone else's perspective, it was the beginning of an investigation. And on the morning of that meeting, as I walked into the conference room and saw the investors taking their seats, I realized how quiet the room felt. Calm, routine, ordinary. My parents walked in a few minutes later, confident, relaxed. My father shook hands with the lead investor. My mother placed their presentation folder on the table. They smiled when they saw me sitting across the room, probably assuming I was there as part of the firm's review team. They had no idea what the meeting was actually about. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. The meeting started exactly the way their previous one had. Quiet introductions. Coffee on the table. The lead investor opened a folder and thanked everyone for attending. My father looked confident, almost relaxed. He believed this was the final step before funding. My mother sat beside him, reviewing the printed financial summaries they had brought again. The same documents. The same numbers. The same projections. Across the table, 2 people sat who hadn't been present during the previous meeting. They didn't introduce themselves right away. They simply observed. The lead investor spoke first. Before we finalize any agreement, our compliance team requested a short verification review. My father nodded immediately. Of course. We expected that. He was calm. Professional. Because, from his perspective, everything had already been verified once. The investor turned slightly. One of the quiet observers spoke. He introduced himself simply as an external regulatory auditor. The room became slightly more still. Not tense yet. Just slower. The auditor didn't accuse anyone. He just opened a laptop. Then he projected a spreadsheet onto the screen. Our review identified 2 financial ledgers submitted by your company. My father leaned forward slightly. My mother didn't move. The auditor continued. One labeled internal accounting. Another spreadsheet appeared beside it, and another labeled Investor Projections. The difference between them was clear even from across the table. Revenue columns, debt totals, large numbers that did not match. The auditor spoke calmly. Could you explain why these two financial records show materially different figures? My father didn't answer immediately. He looked at the screen, then at the printed summary in front of him, then back at the screen. He finally said, "Those are growth projections." The auditor nodded. Yes, that is what the presentation described. He clicked the next file. The video from their earlier investor meeting appeared on the screen. The room watched quietly as my father stood in the recording, pointing to charts. The moment where the investor asked about equipment loans played clearly. My father's recorded voice answered again. Minimal equipment liabilities. The auditor paused the video. Then he opened the internal accounting ledger, highlighted the loan section. Millions in equipment financing. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "Would you like to clarify that statement?" My mother finally spoke. There must be some misunderstanding with the formatting of the documents. The auditor shook his head slightly. He clicked another file. Metadata records. Creation timestamps. User identification. The system clearly showed when the projection spreadsheet had been created. 2 weeks before the investor meeting. And who had created it. The username appeared on the screen. My father's internal company account. No one in the room spoke for a few seconds. The lead investor slowly closed his folder. My father looked around the table. For the first time that morning, he seemed uncertain. Then he noticed something else. He noticed me. Sitting quietly near the end of the table. Not speaking. Not reacting. Just present. His eyes stayed on me for a moment. I didn't look away. I didn't say anything. Because this meeting wasn't about personal arguments. It wasn't about family. It was about documentation. The auditor spoke again. Our responsibility is to determine whether the financial materials presented to investors were materially misleading. He paused briefly. Based on the records we reviewed, the discrepancies are significant. My father tried to respond. But this time the lead investor interrupted. His tone remained professional. We will be suspending all investment discussions effective immediately. He closed the presentation folder. Additionally, this documentation will be forwarded to the Financial Regulatory Authority for further review. No one raised their voice. No one argued. The meeting simply ended. My parents left the room slowly. Neither of them spoke to me. They didn't ask questions. They didn't accuse me. Because at that moment, the evidence in the room had already answered everything. Over the following weeks, the consequences unfolded exactly the way compliance cases usually do. Quietly. Regulators opened a formal investigation into the financial disclosures. The investment deal disappeared completely. Banks reviewing the expansion loans paused their approvals. Several suppliers reconsidered their contracts. The company didn't collapse overnight. Real businesses rarely do. But the expansion stopped immediately, and the investigation required every financial record to be examined carefully. For the first time in years, my parents had to explain their numbers to people who were trained to question them. Not to employees. Not to family. To regulators. We didn't have Sunday dinners after that. Not because of anger. Just distance. No one said much anymore. Months later, I received a short message from my mother. It didn't accuse me of anything. It didn't apologize either. It only said one sentence. You understood business after all. I didn't respond. Because this had never been about proving them wrong. It had been about stopping something before it grew larger. Stopping it before investors lost millions. Stopping it before the consequences became irreversible. Sometimes justice doesn't look dramatic. Sometimes it's just documentation placed in the right hands. And silence afterward. That night, everything was quiet.